after our AGM this morning. Welcome to the commencement of our year and our lecture series throughout the year. Just for those who are visitors or new to the Society as members, we have a lecture on every first Saturday of each month, excluding January, here in the auditorium. So please, if you are visiting and you like what you see, you can join up through our website. You can join up today. If you've got a credit card, I'm able to process that membership as well. If you've got cash, it's $40 for the year. If so, you can do it any time throughout the year. For our current members, just renewal, just remember that our renewal needs to be done by the end of March this year. This morning, I have the pleasure of introducing Dr Daniel Reynaud, who will be speaking to us this morning on fighting McKenzie and other Anzac chaplains of World War I. Dr Daniel is an authority on Australian Great War social history, publishing books on its cinema, wartime spirituality, and Anzac food. And Daniel has brought with him some of his books on the table, and they are for sale. So we can do any transactions at the end of his presentation. He initiated the partial reconstruction of Australia's first Gallipoli movie, The Hero Dardanelles, and has authored and fronted an award-winning series of documentaries on the Anzacs and religion. He is Emeritus Professor of History at Avondale University and is also a visiting historian for the Anzac Memorial here at Hyde Park. We put our hands together to welcome Dr Daniel Reynaud.
Thank you, pleasure to be here. My interest in Anzac religious history came from the fact that looking at Australian social history in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I recognised that there was a little bit of a gap in historiography, both that of academics, but especially in the popular historiography of Anzac on the subject of religion. Most authors state categorically that the Anzacs were not religious, that it was a very secular force. Some have stated outright that they merely tolerated chaplains. That's in the official history of the First World War. And I thought, well, that's an interesting little thing to explore. Bill Gamage went as far as to say in his landmark book, The Broken Years, that there were 3 topics of silence in Anzac diaries. He read the diaries of 1,000 men for his book. And those topics were sex, politics, and religion. And he said of the 3, the third was the most surprising. Indeed, it is the most surprising since his book, The Broken Years, contains dozens of quotes about religion, spirituality, morality, and ethics. So I thought I'd explore this little bit of a gap. I began by reading the diaries of chaplains because I figured if anybody said anything about religion, it ought to be the chaplains. And I was mostly right, although I was struck by some chaplains who virtually never mentioned it. And then I began to spread my wings a little, and I also have read the diaries of 1,000 soldiers. In fact, I've read the diaries and letters of something like 1,300 soldiers. What I can tell you is that they actually frequently mention religion, spirituality, and ethics. Which isn't surprising actually, because the late 1800s and early 1900s was the peak in Australian history for people being engaged with religion. That's the peak of church attendance. It was the peak of newspapers reporting sermons every Monday morning in all the major newspapers. You could read summaries of the sermons that had happened the day before. So religion was actually very present in the lives of the men when they were growing up, the men who became the first AIF. Most of them were born and raised in this period where church going was probably around 40, if not higher, percent of the Australian population. When I began my research, I thought maybe 10% of the Anzacs had some sort of religious commitment. We know that overwhelmingly Australians identified with religion. Something like 96% of Australians identified a religion on their census forms. Of course, we know there was a massive gap between the religion they identified with and actually going to church or having an active spiritual life. But nevertheless, I thought maybe 10%. I was wrong. I was wrong in my first book, which is The Man the Anzacs Revered, where I mentioned that statistic. As I went on, I discovered it's at least 20, maybe 25% of the Anzacs had active spiritual engagement. Furthermore, those who weren't active were not necessarily opposed to religion. Many of them engaged with it, and virtually all of them were raised in a kind of a Christian ethos. So their basic worldview, even though they mightn't have been active Christians, was still fundamentally a biblical worldview. They held basic Christian values, even if they couldn't name a single Christian doctrine. So our starting point has to be that secular means something different in 1914 than it does in 2024. Secular back then meant I'm not active in religion, I don't promote religion, but I recognise that I'm operating within a religious framework. In fact, if you had accused many of the Anzacs of not being Christians, they would have been offended, because it was a fundamentally Christian worldview in Australia. So before we start saying that the Anzacs are secular, we need to understand that term and its context. And yes, there were many men who didn't like formal religion. Something I explored in my second book, Anzac Spirituality. In fact, one of the things they hated the most were church services, the compulsory church parades on a Sunday morning. The funny thing is, most of the objections to the compulsory church parades were, A, I spend 3 hours getting ready for it, then I stand for an hour before the general turns up, then I have to stand through a 1 hour service that I can't hear because I'm at the back. B, the second reason they didn't like them was that they weren't spiritual enough. Only a small proportion of the Anzacs didn't like the services because they were religious. They hated them for all the rigmarole that went around them, or they hated them for not being religious enough. And that was a very surprising find for me to make. And it's based on reading their diaries and adding up the comments for and against. And the comments for and against are better than 2 to 1. Okay? So there's, even as bad as they were, they're still making comments 2 to 1 in favour of compulsory church parades. When we come to the chaplains, the statement that they were often merely tolerated. Chaplains came like generals, colonels, sergeants and privates. There was the entire range. There were those who were exceptionally good. There were those who were pretty bad. And there were a lot of ordinary, decent blokes who did the job they could. It was appreciated and valued, but it didn't make headlines. This morning I'm going to talk about the headline chaplain, William McKenzie. Scottish born, 1869, came to Australia at the age of 14, settled near Bundaberg where his father ran essentially a sugar farm, but of course back in those days it was a bit of mixed farming. He grew up to be a big lad. He loved fighting, he always wanted to be in the army. He topped out at 188 centimetres, weighed 108 kilos, and described his own fists as like being legs of ham. 108 kilos, yeah?
No, 188 centimetres. What is it?
Oh, that'll be 6'4", 5", somewhere around there. Yeah. Professor Google's your best friend in times like this. And his personality was as big as his body. He had a booming voice, excellent singing voice, and just incredibly charismatic. At the age of 19, he got a job as an overseer of a cane farm. The suspicious farmer said, "You look pretty young for this job. How old are you, 21? To which McKenzie said, hang on, I just turned 21 last week. He was still 19. And he managed the farm extremely well. He was raised a strict Presbyterian, as many Scots were, hated it, absolutely hated it. Described his childhood as the shorter catechism, porridge and plenty of lickings. And in his late teens, kind of left formal religion. And then was struck by the Salvation Army which came to town. He hated them because they worked with the down and outs. And if you're a Scots Presbyterian, the down and outs deserve what they get. At the same time, he was deeply impressed by them because nothing fazed them. They got involved with the down and outs. Their reputations, they didn't worry about that, they just helped people. And in a very short order of time, he became a Salvationist. And 2 years later, trained as a Salvation Army officer, and then served in a number of parishes, usually tough coal mining and steel towns. His first parishes were in Newcastle, and he went to Mount Isa, and everywhere he went, he was a success. And those years of being a Salvation Army officer, at a time, by the way, when the Salvation Army was publicly persecuted, even often by the police, he learnt to tough it out. He learned how to get an audience and hold an audience that didn't want him around. He was actually arrested and imprisoned for being a public nuisance by running a meeting in the street. He paid them back with his strength. He actually broke the handle of every axe and mattock that he was given. He made sure he plied them so hard that they broke. And in the end, public opinion forced the magistrate to let him go. In 1914, he was returning from the Salvation Army conference in England when he read about the outbreak of the war, and he instantly volunteered as a chaplain. Now, in those days, the chaplaincy, the Australian Army chaplaincy, was a new force. It had only been established the year before, 1913. And because Australia had no official religion, unlike the English, where the chaplaincy was dominated by the Anglican Church, the Australian government set up my screen's just gone different to that screen, so we'll see how we go. They set up a chaplaincy that was governed by the four major denominations: Anglican, Catholic, Presbyterian, Methodist. And the chaplains allocated to the army were in proportion to the ratios as they were in the 1911 census statistics. Anglicans, about 45% of the population, Catholics 22, Presbyterians 13, Methodists 11. And then there were all the also-rans. McKenzie's Salvation Army, he got in under what was eventually called OPD, Other Protestant Denominations. And that covered the Congregationists, the Baptists, Churches of Christ, Salvation Army, these small groups. Each brigade was composed of 4 battalions, roughly 1,000 men. And the 4 chaplains were attached to brigade level, in theory. And in theory, there were 2 Anglicans, 1 Catholic, and 1 Methodist/Presbyterian per brigade. But in practice, each chaplain was assigned a particular battalion for administrative purposes. And whenever the brigade was in camp, each of the 4 chaplains would run a service, and you could go to whichever one you wanted. So if you were, for instance, Presbyterian or Methodist, you could go to that one. in practice, once they were actually in the field, it was relatively rare for the entire brigade to be together. And so chaplains would simply run a Sunday service, and everybody, it was compulsory, everybody went, unless you found ways of getting out of it. And by the way, even devout Christian soldiers could find ways of getting out of it, because remember, they didn't like them, not because they were religious, but because there was too much stress, or perhaps not religious enough. McKenzie is allocated to the 1st Brigade instead of one of the 2 Anglican chaplains. And he's allocated to the 4th Battalion, which I believe might be of some interest to people here. 4th Battalion, recruited from southern Sydney and the Illawarra district. McKenzie was not popular when he first showed up. The Salvation Army had a reputation as wowsers. You know, the 4 things that soldiers love to do: betting, drinking, gambling, and whoring were the 4 things the Salvation Army preached the most against. And they go, what on earth have we done to deserve this? The chaplaincy corps, being new, didn't have any job definitions, nor any training. There were 2 jobs in the army for which there was no training whatsoever. And that lasted for the entire First World War. The first was the chaplaincy, and my wife can tell you, she's over here, she can tell you the other job for which there was no training or profession, except fairly late in the war, and it was pretty bad. Does anybody know what it was?
Cooks.
The cooks. You're quite right. While the army developed sophisticated ways of training and the AIF became one of the most professional armies in the world by 1918, its cooks were still ranked amateurs. And we have a book coming out with the Australian History Military Society through Canberra. Hopefully it'll come out this year. It's due to be published in 2021, so you'll recognise that's going. But if you want to know about what the AIF ate, my wife is a brilliant foodie and I collaborated on this book. So, chaplains and cooks, no training, no job description. They were expected to run official services on a Sunday, they were expected to bury the dead. All the rest they just made up. Some chaplains thought we need to stick to strictly religious duties, so we'll run prayer meetings and voluntary services, we'll baptise or christen, because if we get involved in anything else, we're diluting the impact of our role as Christian ministers. The other bunch of chaplains said the best way to get people interested in religion is to be engaged in the totality of their lives. And so they got involved in the social committee of the battalion. They're often the chair of it. They're often chair of the officers' mess because for some reason officers felt that a minister of religion was safer with their money than one of their fellow officers. They helped censor soldiers' letters, which soldiers actually preferred. They'd rather the chaplain who wasn't in the line of command reading what they had to say than one of their actual officers. And of course the officers appreciated that as well. Censoring letters was a huge task and officers hated it. William McKenzie's appointed to the 4th Battalion. At his first battalion parade, they counted him out. At his 2nd battalion parade, they counted him in. In a single week, he turned the battalion around. And you know what counting out is, don't you? No? Okay. Back then, if you weren't popular and you got up in front of the crowd would count backwards from 10 to 1. And if you were still there at 1, they got rid of you. They counted him out at his first parade and they counted him in at his 2nd. McKenzie had charisma. He had energy. He had a phenomenal memory. He could meet you once and 20 years later bump into you again, recognise you, tell you where you met and what the conversation was about. Absolutely astonishing memory. He was also highly inventive. He was highly skilled at winning over unimpressed audiences. He'd been a Salvation Army officer for 4 years. He knew the score. He began by running church parades that were so effective that there was a decided denominational drift, which existed in all the brigades. The drift was towards the chaplain who had the most interesting and the shortest sermon. And there are many, well, not many, there are a few historians who play on this to say that the Anzacs weren't terribly religious. Look, even the religious ones sought out the shortest sermon. You are standing for the entire event, remember. So a short sermon's a good idea. McKenzie knew how to hold an audience. Most of the chaplains were regular clergymen, preached every Sunday to congregations that were probably 60% women, to congregations that were probably 80% middle to upper class. Now they've got to preach to a heterogeneous bunch of young men with or without religious background who don't necessarily want to be there. What talent have they developed for holding that kind of audience? Well, McKenzie was already ahead of the pack. That was his normal audience. His work really came to life in, sorry, my screen's died here. Thank you. Mackenzie's work came to life when they moved to Egypt. When they set up camp at Mina, and you can see literally the pyramids peeking over the top of the camp, and this is the 4th Battalion on parade. There were no facilities at all. There were no tents. There was no recreational space. There were no canteens or even kitchens. They had to create everything from scratch when they arrived. And it wasn't long before the bored soldiers, when they weren't on duty, were heading down into Cairo looking for diversion. Cairo had upper-class hotels and restaurants from which the soldiers were banned because they were only good enough for officers. So what did the ordinary soldier do? They wanted to. They discovered alcohol was extremely cheap. They discovered the brothel district of Cairo, which was an eye-popper for absolutely everybody. The Wazir district. McKenzie was highly active. First of all, he created concerts and entertainments and sporting events so that soldiers didn't go into town and get drunk. All the chaplains preached against the brothels. One of them even went into the brothel district at the insistence of his fellow officers. But he was so disgusted by what he saw in the street that he didn't go any further. McKenzie, his Salvation Army. Salvation Army's made its reputation not on avoiding the places where the worst people go, but on being there. And he made it his habit to actually go into the brothels, where he would drag the soldiers out, collect them in groups of about 100 and put them on the tram back to the camp. He wrote home to his Salvation Army boss, "I expect to get stabbed one night because I'm ruining their business." Here's a photo of McKenzie with the soldiers. We do know that the first bunch of men in the AIF were the biggest and the fittest. Right? We believe the Anzacs were tall and rangy men. Look, I've actually literally seen the enlistment papers of every single person who joined the AIF, and that's over 400,000, okay? I've looked at each one. The average height's about 5'6". They weren't big men by today's standards. You can see that the first group, who were big men, and there's McKenzie in the foreground, burly figure, he's taller than them. He was very popular with the soldiers because of what he did. C.E.W. Bean wrote that it was McKenzie who saved the AIF in Egypt, single-handedly. And it was his campaign to create wholesome entertainments and to keep men out of the booze bars and the brothels that was the turning point. On Good Friday, April the 2nd, 1915, there was a riot in the Wazir. Depending on which source you read, will tell you who started it. If you read every other source except the Australian ones, it was the Australians. If you read the Australian ones, it was the New Zealanders. There was a dispute in the brothels. Who knows what it was over? It wasn't long before soldiers were throwing furniture and people over the balconies and setting fire to them in the street. The fire brigade arrived. A bigger crowd arrived as well. The soldiers chopped up the hoses of the fire brigade, and the British Army had to bring in more soldiers to break up the riot. It was one of two big riots in the Wazir district, and some soldiers said the guy who started it and led it was William McKenzie. McKenzie heard about this and he was quite chuffed actually, because he'd actually said in one of his sermons, "I wish that whole district would be burnt down." And some of the soldiers said, "Well, let's give him his wish." But there are some sources that say he was physically there. He wasn't. I've read the diary. He was actually back in the camp. He had a very intense, mystical, spiritual experience. He was prone to that. He's one of these personalities that has huge highs, deep lows, and he'd had this mystical, spiritual encounter with God on Easter Friday, and then taken the church service and then packed, because April 2 was the day they learnt they were leaving. They didn't know where to. They were leaving Cairo, of course, going to Gallipoli eventually. That's not McKenzie on Anzac Beach. That's when we were doing some documentaries there. We know April 25, the various Australian brigades, battalions landed at Anzac Cove. The 1st Brigade was the last wave to land. McKenzie was not among them. Chaplains were forbidden from landing. There was a very stone-deaf Catholic chaplain, I say stone-deaf in quotation marks, because Chaplain Fahey from West Australia actually landed with the 1st wave. And he had a year's worth of adventures in the first 3 days. He had guys on either side of him shot. He had a tin he was eating out of, shot out of his hands. He had the book he was reading from shot through. He had bullets through his pack, and he survived untouched. McKenzie would have been incredibly jealous, because McKenzie's the kind of guy who, the more dangerous it is, the more drawn he was to it. Let me give you a quick experience from much later in life. In the 1930s, he was sent to China as a missionary during the height of its famine and civil wars. He was actually held up by bandits who held him at pistol point, wanting money because he was a Westerner. Of course, Salvation Army, he was as poor as a church mouse. And eventually, they bluffed their way out of it by persuading the bandits that the local warlord was protecting McKenzie and his crew. Well, he's held literally with a pistol in his head for half an hour, and he says, "Oh, funniest thing in my life. Absolutely loved it." And so if it's dangerous, he likes it. He lands 2 weeks later. His first job is to bury his commanding officer who was killed on the 2nd day. Lieutenant Colonel A.J.O. Thompson, and he buried him in the side wall of a trench with bullets going over his head. Later, of course, exhumed and buried in the appropriately 4th Battalion Parade Ground Cemetery at Anzac. On Gallipoli, there was no rear lines that were safe. Chaplains, in theory, weren't supposed to go to the front. They were supposed to stay back when their battalions rotated through the lines. There was no back line. McKenzie's dugout was actually the one closest to the Turkish wire. Typical McKenzie. And this is a photograph of him conducting a burial service on Gallipoli. It's an unusual one in that it's been conducted by day. Generally speaking, it was too dangerous to bury by day, and so the services were held at night. And a typical day for a chaplain was being down at the beach hospitals, visiting the wounded, bringing supplies up through Monash Gully, and going to wherever your battalion was stationed, walking through the trenches and meeting with men in small groups of 5, 8, 10. On Sunday, they would lead services because there weren't enough chaplains on Gallipoli. Some got sick, some got sent to base hospitals. They were running 4 or 5 or 6 services a day on a Sunday. They'd find a clearing and run a bit of a service, anything from 50 to 200 men. And then at night, they were conducting burials, and it was not unusual for a chaplain to go to bed at about 4 in the morning. And they're up again at 6 to repeat the whole process. I don't know how many of you have been to Gallipoli. I've been there several times. It's not easy country. It's extremely rugged. And by the way, the safest place at Gallipoli was in the front lines. Because you're in a trench. The dangerous job was moving from the beach to the trenches, because you are quite exposed going through Monash Gully. And McKenzie is always on the move. I'm photographed here with the flag that he was given by the Salvation Army at his farewell in Sydney. And it's the flag that he put on the coffins of the men that he buried. And you can see that it has lived a very vigorous frontline existence. It's now held in the Salvation Army Museum at Box Hill in Sydney, if you want to go and see it. So on top of working all day and then being up all night conducting funerals, McKenzie went further. There was one section of the track that was so steep that the stretcher bearers and the water carriers were always slipping and skidding on it. So one night, without asking or telling anyone, he didn't have any funerals on, he got out his shovel and he dug steps into that steep bit of track. I don't know if this is actually it. This is a bit of track leading to the 4th Battalion Parade Ground Cemetery. It's probably not it. He never told anybody that he did it. The next day, soldiers wake up and suddenly this steep, slippery bit of track has got stairs. They asked around, they eventually found out it was McKenzie. He was hard to stop. There he is, right on the front line with the soldiers. He lived exactly their life. By the way, when they were training in Egypt, most chaplains stayed back and didn't bother. He went on the training marches with them. And when young 20-something-year-old soldiers got tired, the 44-year-old McKenzie would carry their pack. He would often finish a training march of 20 or 30 kilometres with 3 or 4 soldiers' packs on his back. He would start at the front, but he'd end up at the back rallying the stragglers as they got off their march. It's that kind of thing that made him hugely popular, because there was nothing the soldiers did that he didn't. He dug trenches with them. He dug them deeper and faster and better. One of the majors in his battalion said, if you want an answer to any military question, ask McKenzie, because he knows better than any of the officers. How deep should a parados be? Ask McKenzie. What's the trajectory of a 7.7 centimetre German artillery shell? Ask McKenzie, he knows. This is the kind of thing that won their respect. We see a lot of photos of Gallipoli, and it's basically devoid of vegetation. That's because soldiers ran out of firewood, so they cut down everything. When they cut it down, they dug up the roots and burnt them. That's how it looks today, and that's probably fairly similar to how it looked at the time. But that is, of course, Monash Valley, up which all supplies went and all men went down, and it was overlooked by Turkish positions and regularly sniped. McKenzie probably did that journey twice a day. This is the 4th Battalion Parade Ground Cemetery. Many of the men interred there were buried by McKenzie. They're not necessarily there. This is a post-war consolidation of the various graves. Probably the best known grave at Gallipoli. By the way, we often think of Simpson as the biggest name on Gallipoli, certainly the most famous one to have survived. Archie Barwick, whose brilliant diaries have been published, said there were 2 outstanding personalities at Gallipoli. One of them was William Birdwood, the British general in charge of the AIF. The other? Not Simpson, William McKenzie. The chaplain of a single battalion was renowned over the entire peninsula. If you ask the soldiers who's the most famous soldier at Gallipoli, they'd have given you those 2 Williams, Birdwood and McKenzie. Simply because of the incredible way he engaged with the men. He wrote once of a church service that he ran overlooking the Aegean Sea, and he writes of it in mystical terms. sun setting over the sea, the sound of soldiers' voices rising. They're singing a hymn, and as they sing the hymn, a platoon of soldiers marches past to go to its post. And as they go past, the soldiers, the marching soldiers, pick up the song. And there's kind of this magical atmosphere that sits over this church service. And he noted it particularly well because it was the last service before the August 6 attack on Lone Pine, at the end of which most of the soldiers who attended that service were either dead or wounded. So he left Gallipoli an absolute legend. In fact, there were stories going around that he actually led the attack on Lone Pine, armed with a shovel and a Bible. Now, the role of a chaplain in an attack was with the battalion doctor back at battalion HQ. McKenzie was restless, and he asked the battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel McNaden, "Can I please go up with the men?" And he said, "You can go up in the forward trenches, but you're not allowed out of them during the attack." So McKenzie actually went up to the very front trenches, and he ran several messages backwards and forwards. He noted that men around him were nervous, some were shaking, a number were reading their Bibles, but he had this sense of exhilaration. McKenzie almost certainly never accompanied the first wave, but he certainly was involved at some point, because on the very next day, a lieutenant from the 1st Battalion said, "The fighting was so hot, I wanted a little break. I tried to sneak off, and I bumped into a chaplain who just looked at me." He was sorting the dead from the wounded and burying the dead. And that one look was enough. I turned around and went back to my post. And he said, that chaplain was fighting Mac, the Salvationists. So we know that in the first 24 hours of the battle, McKenzie had crossed no man's land at Lone Pine and was actually in the trenches. And his descriptions to his wife are horrific. He buried about 450 men in the next 3 weeks, which is an astonishing feat. He would have dug the graves of many of those himself. Not quite as good as the Salvation Army newsletter in the early 2000s that said he buried 2,000 men in the same time, while living on 2 pannikins of water and a couple of biscuits. I defy you to dig 2,000 graves in 3 weeks on your own, let alone run a church service, burial service. By the end of the Battle of Lone Pine, McKenzie was literally getting around Gallipoli on his hands and knees. He was so debilitated by dysentery and neuralgia. Every part of his body ached. He refused to be evacuated. Eventually he recovered a little. He went to France, where he had himself photographed in the latest kit, which included, of course, the steel Brodie helmet. And in France, his influence continued. He was actively engaged at the Battle of Pozières, where the 4th Battalion captured a strategic point called Gibraltar. The British nicknamed it Gibraltar. He was actually legendary for a song, which I published an article recently called the Sunshine Song. It was the chorus from a hymn, and he turned it into a rousing, cheering song that even though everything's going bad, I carry my sunshine with me wherever I go. And his concerts were legendary. They wouldn't let anyone else be in charge of a concert if McKenzie was around. There's one concert, they had 3,000 men packed into a 2,000-seat hall, with men outside ripping the matting off the walls so they could participate. And one soldier reported he had the he had the audience in the palm of his hand. If you can imagine 3,000 plus rowdy soldiers, and they obeyed his every word. That's the kind of man he was. His Sunshine Song was legendary. And in post-war reunions, whenever people bumped into fighting Mac, they'd spontaneously start singing this song. McKenzie went into no man's land in the middle of the Battle of Pozières, which, by the way, is one of the 2 worst battles the Australians were involved in terms of casualties, Pozières and Fromelles. Pozières was considered to be the battle where the most artillery was poured on the Australian soldiers. He went into no man's land in the middle of the battle at night, collecting bodies and burying them. And at one point, he stood on a mound in no man's land and sang the Sunshine Song at full volume. Not a single shot was fired at him. This is the cemetery at Bouziers. McKenzie threw himself into his work so much that he never gave himself time to recover. The debilitation at Gallipoli, the work he put in at Bouziers and in other places. He started canteens for the soldiers, which he would actually have in the reserve trenches. So that soldiers going in and out, they could get a hot cuppa going in, and on the way out they could get cigarettes or some biscuits or something like that. Just an absolutely legendary figure. By the end of 1917, he was falling sick so often that they decided to send him home. He arrived in March 1918 to a celebrity welcome. He spoke in the exhibition hall in Melbourne, which seats 7,000 people. It was standing room only. It didn't matter where he went in Australia, crowds met him. When he first came to Sydney, it was said that his feet never touched the ground from the town hall station to the rostrum in the town hall. Post-war, his offices were in Sydney. It once took him an hour to travel 3 blocks because every time he stepped outside, people wanted to talk to him. A visiting Salvation Army officer from England came back after an hour and said, "Did you get to the hall where you're going to hold a meeting?" And he said, "No." "Well, where's McKenzie?" "Oh, he's still in the street talking to people." He couldn't walk 200 metres in an hour because of the press of people wanting to talk to him. McKenzie is an exception. He's the most legendary chaplain. I'm about to begin the biography of who I think is the second greatest chaplain of World War I and our most decorated, Walter Dexter, the only chaplain to have served on the front line for the entire war. As I said, chaplains came in all sizes and shapes and effectiveness. Some were pretty useless. Some were outstanding. Many did an extremely good job of being with their men, of comforting them, of providing social services and social welfare and entertainments. In my reading of 1,300 soldiers' diaries, the chaplain is more likely to be named, and remember there's only one chaplain per battalion, the chaplain is more likely to be named in soldiers' letters and diaries than the colonel, of which there's only one as well. So I think we may have underrated the work that the chaplains did, particularly as the Army had a massive gap in terms of support services for soldiers. They had never thought through, how do we keep soldiers entertained when they're off duty? How do we keep morale up? What do we do to make sure when soldiers are off duty, what they're doing isn't harming their military effectiveness by getting drunk, by getting VD, by being AWOL? And it was on the chaplains largely, along with support services like the YMCA, which I'm currently writing an article on. These services were crucial support services that allowed the AIF to focus on being an effective military force. So I think we owe our chaplains a better statement than most soldiers dislike them. Most soldiers made a show of not being religious. Most soldiers, when approached one-to-one, were actually quite keen to talk about faith and belief and what happens when I die. Chaplains were there for those points. Their one-to-one engagement with soldiers was extremely important. Their ability to sustain morale, to preach in the morality of the British Empire's mission. I mean, we might quibble with the theology of that today, but it was something they all believed in. Their ability to sustain that kind of belief in the mission and the purpose of the AIF. Their capacity to run things like battalion sports, concerts, run canteens, etc. Just so important and so consistently underrated when we look at the history of the AIF in the First World War. Thank you.
We do have moments for questions.
Yeah. How did we finish up? What happened after the war? Just briefly.
So McKenzie comes home in April 1918, where he's an instant celebrity because something else he did I didn't mention. He noticed soldiers who didn't get mail, their morale dropped. Mail is more important than food to a soldier. So he wrote home to the Salvation Army and said, would you please advertise in the newspapers to write a letter addressed to a lonely soldier and send them all to me. He came to regret that statement because he thought he might get 20 or 30 letters a week. By the end of the war, he was getting 400 to 800 letters every mail, and he would carry them in his pack. And as he bumped into soldiers, I've got the report from a soldier's diary, I read it. As we were walking through the trenches, we bumped into Fighting Mac. He wasn't even their battalion chaplain, not even their brigade chaplain, completely different brigade. And he said, "Hi fellas, how you going? Have you had a letter recently?" "No." "Oh, look, I've got one for you." And he'd pull them out of his pack and hand them over. That request was distributed across newspapers Australia-wide. So when he came home, he was a household name. They published his letters home. They'd pinch them out of the Salvation Army newsletter and publish them in, but they did that all the time. You know, look up an article on Trove from the First World War, and you'll often find it's been reprinted 20 or 30 times in all the regional papers. That's what happened to Mackenzie's letters home. He was famous. March 1918, the war is on a knife's edge. And they want the latest from the greatest. His first stopover was Perth, where he'd never been as a Salvation Army officer. He had nothing to do with any of the West Australian battalions. And it was a sellout audience. It was literally a sellout audience because they charged you to go to the meeting as a fundraiser. Appointed Salvation Army Commissioner for one half of Australia. At the time it was 2 separate territories. Just an absolute legend. He couldn't move without crowds being there everywhere he went. Country, New South Wales, whatever. Did 2 stints as a missionary in China. Extremely dangerous conditions. Just lapped it up. Just loved it. His health started to go. Retired at the age of 69 when his fabulous memory started to fail him. But it was interesting. I'm dealing with an aged mother at the moment. The things they forget is the last thing they've been told. I've got a fabulous memory from 20, 30 years ago. He never forgot a soldier. People would travel literally across Australia in a day when there weren't a lot of trains. They would spend 3 weeks travelling because they knew he was out at Deniliquin or somewhere ridiculous. And they'd go, "Please tell me about my soldier son. What's your name?" "Oh, now I met him, da-da-da-da," and this was the conversation. 20, 30 years later, phenomenal. So 69, he retires. He dies at the age of 77. He had dementia for the last 8 or 10 years of his life. Sometimes was digging trenches in the neighbour's front yard, searching for bodies to bury and stuff like that. So a bit of a sad end, but an absolute hero, a legend. It's considered that he's possibly the most famous soldier of the First World War in the eyes of the soldiers. Now, we got a statue to Simpson out front of the War Memorial. If you'd asked the AIF, it probably would have been McKenzie. But how do you fit someone who brings booze, bad language, betting and brothels into the Anzac legend? Mackenzie's problem was that he lived too long to be part of the legend. Simpson's was that he died young enough to be a legend. And when you're dead, you can make up any story you like because no one's around to contradict it. His family was in England after all. So in some ways, the Simpson legend was manufactured, as a couple of really good historical critiques have pointed out, for propaganda, for recruiting purposes. Mackenzie was the real legend, yeah.
Evidence suggests that the conscription referenda unleashed a certain level of, shall we say, sectarianism in Australia, which persisted, in fact, probably persisted in some parts, possibly even to this day, it certainly did for a long time.
Yes.
How did he react to that? I mean, how did he react, or did he write or say anything about the issue of conscription or about the issue of the referendum?
Virtually doesn't speak about it, in short. I do have a forthcoming article on the Anzacs in politics. Remember, there were 3 things the Anzacs didn't write about. Gamage was absolutely right about politics, they didn't write about it, and the issue they wrote the most about was conscription, and on the whole they were opposed to it.
Yes, that's right.
But not exclusively. They also wrote a lot about women, and I'm going to be co-authoring a series of articles with one of the Anzac Memorial Zone on the role of the relationship between soldiers and the women in their lives. So really looking forward to that, Katie. Yeah.
In a sociological sense, I suspect that little changed through to the early 1950s, and particularly in the context of Australian servicemen
Yes.
and World War II in particular.
Yes.
I imagine that what you're talking about in your lead up to McKenzie
Yes.
might equally have applied in 1939 and 45.
You are exactly right. I have done many presentations to audiences that were overwhelmingly people of military service, mostly from World War II. And my most familiar response is nodding heads. The interesting thing is that the historiography doesn't match what actually happened. That's part of what I'm trying to do, to address that gap in the historiography. Military history has ignored the spiritual dimension of soldiers' lives. Ironically, Australia has turned the Anzac legend into its secular faith, but it has denied the spirituality of the men who gave them that religion.
But he wasn't really spiritual, he just cared for them.
What's
He
spiritual?
looked after, I would have thought,
McKenzie reckoned he witnessed 2,000 to 3,000 conversions during his service of 3 years. He was aggressively evangelical. He was always trying to convert soldiers. And ironically, he was the best loved chaplain. I've read very widely on the Anzacs and religion. Many chaplains, many evangelists. Norwood, Australia's best known evangelist, it's estimated that he preached to 200,000 Australian soldiers during the First World War in France and in England. That's 2/3 of the AIF. And they didn't have to go. They were purely voluntary meetings. They must have been incredibly bored if they went to an evangelistic meeting. And some of them only went because they were incredibly bored, let's face it. But they weren't as resistant to religion as we sometimes make out. Okay, it's the historians. Australian historiography is famous for ignoring religion. That's one of the statements you can make about Australian historiography. And if you want to be ignored as an Australian historian, write on religion, and I'll testify to that. Actually, one of my books was supposed to be published by one of the big publishers in Australia, and they did something really unusual. They sent me the minutes of the meeting for why they chose not to. And they gave me 4 reasons why they would have. Well written, fills a niche, interesting to read, and the 4 reasons against. You use the word Anzacs, and we want you to use the word diggers. Okay, that's search replace in word, isn't it? Number 2, your book's about religion. Number 3, if we publish a book on religion, we're going to look like we're a religious publisher. Number 4, we hope it gets published, and when it does, we're going to get a copy. So yeah, try being a religious historian in Australia. It's not just the military religious history. Yeah, I belong to a religious history association, and when I first joined, the most overwhelming response was, wow, and you're employed as a historian? Because the minute you advertise you're in any way Christian or religious, your job chances tend to go down the gurgler. Which is really sad. It's kind of a reverse prejudice. Yeah. Yes?
Do his sermons show why they were popular?
Yes. Now, Mackenzie's a classic Salvationist. Salvationists are all about action and not much about theory. So he's no theologian. They're very practical. He's terrific at telling stories. The stories are often really funny, and the punchline, the theological punchline, is in the joke. Next, they were short. I mean, as I said, he had years of experience of holding reluctant audiences in the streets of Australia. So that's the reason. In Egypt, when soldiers could still choose which parade they went, 4,000 men in the brigade, he was attracting well over 2,000 to his services. which left the remainder to the other 3 chaplains to fight over. And to be honest, some chaplains didn't like him for that reason.
Yeah, you said about the flying who was getting amongst the soldiers. Don't you think they were so close to death, like they were witnessing it every day?
Yeah.
And I'm sort of blown away. You said you buried 400 soldiers at one time. Was it 2,000 got killed in?
Yes, but I'm not sure of the total death rate, but yeah. He was one of, I think, 12 or 13 officers at the end from his battalion who wasn't wounded. Yeah. Look, the famous statement, there are no atheists in foxholes. My reading of soldiers' diaries is before their first battle, they all get intensely religious. And that's certainly borne out by what they say. By the 3rd battle, they're kind of going, well, that guy prayed and he got killed. Being religious isn't a ticket to safety now. I've got a famous story that's been published in Christian circles. A guy who had a New Testament in his pocket that stopped a pellet at Gallipoli. And they're touting, you see, the Bible saved his life. 2 years later, he's in France, he's a sergeant, he's been asked to lead a patrol in no man's land. He says to his men, let's pray for safety before we go out. As he bows his head, it passes a Tommy gun in the trenches and he's shot through the head and killed. Praying for safety. So, you know, religion wasn't an insurance policy. And the more experienced soldiers got, the less they attributed God or faith to their survival. Even Christian soldiers tended to use the word fate fairly often, because it did seem like a thrill. There was another question.
Yes. Just curious about his private life. Can you touch on that?
Yes, so he married, of course back then Salvation Army officer could only marry a Salvation Army officer. There was a young lady in one of the churches he was working at who he thought was particularly likely to be a good officer. And she wondered why he was paying so much attention to her spiritual welfare. She became an officer, and she was actually of Alsatian origin with a German surname. She was petrified during the entire war that the authorities would find out she was of German origin and be interned. She was also petrified that her impetuous, action-loving husband would get himself killed. By the way, there were numerous instances where McKenzie literally, I'm talking about mystical, literally heard a voice speak to him saying, don't move. And he didn't. Or get out of here, move 30 metres that way. Every time, that voice saved him from death. Extraordinary. But yeah, so 5 kids, one of whom died in childhood while he was serving in New Zealand as editor of the War Cry. 3 boys and a girl survived to adulthood. He was such a big personality. He really overshadowed his kids. His eldest son said at his funeral, you know, it was an honour to be his son, but it was also quite a burden. One of them actually literally fled to Canada just to get out from the shadow. I've met a number of his relatives, descendants in Canada and America. So worked for the Salvation Army. Only one of his children stayed with the Salvation Army, but all of them remained Christian. And I talked to 2 of his grandchildren, one of whom was about 20 when he died, had often stayed at his home. She gave me such wonderful stories. The other is one of the leaders in the Quaker movement, Society of Friends in Australia. Never met him, but has a lot of family history and actually also helped me with the book from an academic point of view. Really wonderful contribution. Did that answer your question? Yeah. The mum had a lot of trouble with the boys growing up because she wasn't a natural mum, and that's not saying anything bad against her. She just wasn't a natural mum. And particularly of teenage boys, with the dad away, she had a terrible war between fear of being arrested, trying to control the kids, and feeling that her husband was certain to get killed.
I just wanted to say about the soldiers. My grandfather went away to war when he was 20, and he was very religious. He came back just about an atheist.
Yeah.
Yes.
His thing on that was, if there was a God, he would not have allowed
Yes.
what we had to see and do.
So I found a number of instances of that. I've also found instances of absolute atheists who became Christians because of their war experience. Generally speaking, and another academic agrees with me on this, the war didn't change people's religious outlook. It tended to confirm what they already believed. So the atheists became more atheists, the Christians became more devout. What tended to happen was that Christians tended to weaken their connection with organised religion. So they stayed believing Christians, but they didn't like the way the churches behaved during the war. The two organisations who ended the war with enhanced reputations were the Salvation Army and the YMCA, because both of them maintained positions at the front line. They were visible.
Just on behalf of our audience this morning, Daniel, can I just thank you for such an engaging presentation on an aspect of World War I that is very rarely read and heard. So yeah, thank you so much. We'll put our hands together for Daniel.